I'm Holly Page, co-founder of No Labels, here for another edition of No Labels Talks with my friend and colleague, the intellectual engineer of our effort to power the middle, Ryan Clancy. How are you doing, Ryan?
Good. How are you, Holly?
Very well, thank you.
Hey, I want to let everybody who's listening in on this. So usually when we record these things, our colleague Marianne is kind of like the silent partner. She's just she's kind of like our overlord. But she had to run away and she just left us alone to take this. So we could just turn this into like a George Carlin routine. Just do the 7 words you can't say on TV.
I like it.
She can't stop us.
She can't stop us. I know. If there were big bowls of candy, we'd just eat it all.
Our overlord is gone. So this is completely unfiltered.
So Ryan, we survived the debate. We survived the post-debate coverage. And I don't know what the date count is, but it's under 60 days now until we know our collective fate. What are you thinking about the presidential campaign and anything else in politics?
Well, I think the fact that the way you frame this election is that with 60 days till we know our collective fate, that's like how you that's how you describe like you're getting test results back from an MRI.
I kind of think we're waiting for our sentencing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
It was I mean, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have been insane that we had a debate like this. But I guess we're all desensitized now. I will say this. One thing that really stuck out to me in the debate is just the absolute contempt that the two of them have for one another.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I was actually looking at, I don't think Trump looked at her. Like, so he came out, they shook hands. And then when you showed the split screen, I don't think he looked at her one time. It was simmering.
Absolutely. I mean, luckily for me, we were in Colorado at Colorado State University, Fort Collins, which we had a terrific event there. But I only got to see the first 15 minutes because we had to leave for the airport. And I was kind of grateful for that, honestly, because it was just like waiting for another, car wreck at any moment. But I do think that the debate ties into our guest that we had on No Labels Talks, who you'll introduce in a minute. But, the conversation so far, this campaign is largely devoid of an honest conversation with the American people about some really serious issues happening at home and abroad. And I think it's one of the reasons why we like to bring the type of guests that we have today and other kind of thought leaders so that we can help our network at least get informed about these issues, because we're not having it through our political conversations nationally.
Well, it gets to this bigger question of like, well, what is this election really about?
Mm-hmm.
What is any election really about? And on any given day, when you just look at the coverage and like what we read about, what we obsess about is very often not remotely the most important thing. Like one of the things we get into in a bit with our guest, Joe Sternberg, who's from the Wall Street Journal, he wrote this book about how kind of the defining tension in our society right now, in his view, is between the boomers and the generations coming up. And the fact that he feels like the government has just made this whole series of decisions that in all kinds of different ways advantage the boomers and help them accumulate things and wealth and power and influence. And then all the generations coming up are kind of knocking on the door and not being let in. That speaks to housing policy and interest rate policy, tax policy and everything else. That's kind of what an election would be about, but we're not talking about any of that stuff.
Well, I think obviously I, completely can relate with what he's saying, being Gen X myself, but also politically. I mean, the boomer generation of politicians have left us a mess, an absolute mess. And I think the hallmark of their generation was to dismantle a lot of institutions that no longer were relevant or maybe oppressed people. I mean, they had good reasons for doing so, but not quite as much focus on what takes its place. And I think this is true in so many aspects of society, eliminating the draft, for example, not that I'm advocating for that, but what are those common things that connect us as Americans? That kind of, that part of the conversation never happened.
No, well, and that's another thing that Joe talks about, this kind of like atomization of our society. People aren't parts of things. Like I've been thinking for a while, the fact that people are just so obsessive and even like deranged about politics, like in some ways you wonder, is this the void, like the fact that people don't go to church as much anymore and they're searching for something. And in the absence of, religion, it's politics or climate change, or like it just takes on a religious character to it. The problem, of course, is like, when you're talking about religious beliefs, they tend to not be so open for negotiation. Believe what you believe, and that's that, which is fine for religion, not so great for politics.
I thought the other terrific aspect of your conversation with Joe was the connection that he continually makes, that political dysfunction leads to economic dysfunction, and economic dysfunction leads to more political dysfunction. And we are in this endless loop. And I think it is the work of No Labels to try to interrupt that and put us on a different path. So that was a very strong theme throughout your entire conversation with Joe.
Well, this tees up nicely what really the main subject was, which was Joe wrote a column in the Journal last week about a potential October surprise. And it's a reminder that, this week the debate feels like the most important thing in the world, but in a couple of weeks something could happen and that could be turned into the defining issue of the campaign, in the same way that the financial crisis did in advance of the 2008 campaign. So Joe talks about the economic situation in China, the political tumult in Europe, even the, here domestically, kind of risks that are out there in the commercial real estate market. And he talks a lot about exactly what you're saying, which is this interplay between the dysfunction in our politics and the economy, and how they can feed on each other to make things worse. So we're going to talk about October surprises and many other things here on No Labels Talks this week. So everybody enjoy our talk with Joe Sternberg. Hey everybody, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with another edition of No Labels Talks. Lot to talk about this week. We of course had the debate just a couple of nights ago, and we're lucky to have with us Joe Sternberg, who is the political economics columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Joe, thanks for joining us.
But hey, Ryan, thanks for having me on.
So a little bit about Joe, he's been with the Journal since 2006, where he got started in Hong Kong covering Asia. He writes pretty regularly about economic issues, how they relate to what's going on over in Europe, in Asia. I want to start, Joe, with your column last week, where you talked about the possibility of an October surprise. This is something you actually first wrote about last year, and you identified three things in particular that could happen that could throw this election up in the air. And they were as follows: a recession in China, a continuation of the financial tumult we saw with the regional banks last year, and political paralysis in Europe. I'd love for you to just start by talking us through why at this moment do you think those three are the ones we should really have on our radar?
Yeah, Ryan. Well, so the backdrop here is, I think we're now in a situation where the world is a more dangerous place than it's been in many years. And that's really creating a very worrying backdrop to this election season that we're stuck in the middle of right now. And I think, my thought, especially as a columnist who writes a lot about the economy, is that a lot of this focus on global dangers is focusing on political issues or military issues. So people understand the Middle East has become a very dangerous place, and that this is an important part of the backdrop for the election campaign. People understand that Ukraine is a hot spot. People understand that we need to be worried about China's rise and some of the military and strategic implications of that in Asia. My point is that there are also economic risks that I don't think that people are thinking enough about, because the world has also become a very dangerous place economically. And the three items that you listed off there that I wrote about in the column, I think are some of the three big economic risks that are companions to these geostrategic risks that everyone is aware has developed. So, if we start overseas, I think developments in China, the slowdown in the Chinese economy, the property crisis that's been unfolding there for 4 or 5 years now, the fact that they don't seem to have a plan to recover that. I mean, this is the world's second or third largest economy, depending on how you count. It is a major trading partner of the US, whether we want it to be or not. A lot of American companies have built business plans over the years that are very dependent on continuing trade with China, not just with China being a source for products that would be manufactured and exported into the US, but China as a market for American goods and services. And so it's a big risk that large economy is no longer firing on all cylinders. You can say the same thing in a different way about Europe, another major trading and investment partner for the US in both directions. Currently, the theme over here, I'm based in London, is political paralysis, which is starting to bleed into economic paralysis in a lot of ways. What are the dangers that something goes awry in a European economy that is in the middle of a political paralysis or some kind of economic problem that might develop over here and very quickly becomes contagious to the US. And then the third risk is the US economy, because I think that a lot of people are becoming very complacent about the fact that so far we've more or less survived the higher inflation of a couple of years ago, even though that was very difficult for a lot of American households. And the economy has more or less survived the process of trying to bring that inflation under control. But we are not at the end of that cycle by a long stretch. And I think that there are a lot of dangers in the US economy related to this process of gradually unwinding from this very distorted economy that we've had over really the past 15 years, try to get ourselves back to normal. Historically, that's been a very difficult process for any economy. And historically, when problems develop, they start to happen very quickly. So I think those are the big three themes that I wanted to talk about. And the overarching point here is that you can't think about this as a dangerous world only in terms of the military dimension or the strategic or the political. We also have to be thinking about the economic dimension to those risks.
So, Joe, let's start at home, and then we'll look at some of the situations abroad. But to remind people, we had this situation last spring, the spring of 2023, in which suddenly you had a couple regional banks get in trouble and go under. And it was a very simple story, which was they had a lot of debt on their books, or they'd given out a lot of loans at very low interest rates. And then interest rates started going up, and those suddenly became a lot less valuable. And we had kind of a classic run on some of these banks until it got stabilized. But interestingly enough, you had this very tense couple weeks, and then it did kind of stabilize. First Republic got bought by JP Morgan, and a couple other banks got acquired by others, and yet it's been pretty quiet on that front since. I guess my two questions to you is, why did we have this boomlet of panic followed by stability? And what specifically would concern you that could come back around in the fall?
Well, so Ryan, as you pointed out, I first wrote about this potential for an October 2024 surprise about the economy this time last year, when we wrote about the 6-month mark after Silicon Valley Bank. And it was because I was sitting here at my desk in London and I thought, well, hang on a sec. We all remember the Lehman Brothers collapse that happened in October of 2008 and the financial panic that followed on from that, and it eventually, metastasized into the Great Recession. What people tend to forget is that that crisis unfolded over a very long time. It wasn't just that one event. It's 6 months before that event. You had had Bear Stearns in March of 2008. And in August before that, so August of 2007, you had had some of the first inklings of trouble in hedge funds that were overexposed to subprime mortgages. And a year or two before that, you started to see the beginnings of an uptick in mortgage default. So I think the point was that we tend to think of a financial crisis as a very discrete, short-term, sudden event, but actually it can be something that unfolds over a very long time. And you have these periods of quiet that, in retrospect, when you're going through it, it's not obvious if the storm has passed. And then only in retrospect will you realize, yes, the storm had passed, or no, we were just in the eye of it. And so I am not at all going to definitely predict that we're headed for another financial crisis, but I think that you shouldn't necessarily draw false comfort from the fact that it has now been a while since that first round of tremors, particularly because of the nature of the tremors that we had last year. Um, I would sort of develop or expand on the way that you characterize the Silicon Valley Bank and the regional bank crisis by pointing out the specific problem they ran into was actually that they discovered that very safe assets they thought they were holding, US Treasury bonds, turned out not to be immune to the effects of rising interest rates. And so it was actually these assets that people had thought were rock solid and, in important ways are rock solid, but were still behaved in ways that could create this balance sheet problem and trigger a bank run. And so, what are some of the less safe things that are floating around out there? I mean, we're still in the very early stages of figuring out what's going on with commercial real estate and the billions upon billions of dollars of commercial real estate loans that American banks have on their balance sheets. So far we've survived higher short-term interest rates for the past year, 2 years, but that's because a lot of these very cheap loans haven't really rolled over yet. So, the point of this is that you have this process rolling forward. And I very much hope that it's going to work out okay. You can sketch out a scenario where you think that it will, but you can also sketch out a scenario where you have to worry that it won't. And so again, and I suspect this is going to be a theme that we'll talk about a fair bit during our chat today. The political question then becomes, are any of the candidates that we've got, do they seem to be up to the challenge that they might face if there is an economic crisis of some sort? And I think that that is something that perhaps should be, sitting on voters' minds alongside a bunch of other issues that voters are thinking about this autumn.
Yes. Well, we all remember, in 2008, if he had his druthers, I mean, John McCain would have loved to have run a campaign about foreign policy and national security and all kinds of other issues, but events kind of forced his hand, and he needed to, try to become the candidate to guide us through the crisis. But before we get to the other two, Europe and China, I want to ask you, if one of these things did happen, what impact do you think that would have on the race? More specifically, because Vice President Harris is not the incumbent, but she's in the current administration. Is that necessarily a bad thing for whomever is currently in power? And do any of these things necessarily advantage the competitor? Or might there be scenarios where it could be bad for Trump?
Well, I think that the short answer is going to be that this is such an unusual year that you can't directly predict based on past results. But I think that in general, really negative events or crises tend not to help an incumbent because the question immediately becomes, well, why didn't you do something to protect us from whatever is the thing that has just happened? And you kind of saw an element of that in 2008, where although George W. Bush was not running again, the Republicans were definitely the incumbent party, and so John McCain had the problem of trying to explain how a president of his own party had allowed this crisis to develop. But I think that that's always going to be one factor. But the bigger factor is also when you have a crisis, voters respond well, I think, to politicians who can explain what is happening in a coherent way and explain what, if anything, that they think government or policymakers should do about it, who can offer people some kind of roadmap forward. And I think that this also was something that we saw back in 2008, where you could tell that John McCain was really struggling terribly to explain to the voters what he thought was happening in the crisis and what the way forward should be. Barack Obama had an explanation which you can agree or disagree with, but I think that oftentimes the prize will go to anyone who is prepared to try to offer a coherent view. And so from that perspective, would Donald Trump be good at offering a coherent explanation of a complicated event? I mean, that's an interesting question, and it might countervail some of the, downside that Kamala Harris would have as the incumbent party.
I want to ask you about China, which of course is where you started your career at the Journal. And, there was this sense China, of course, had much more draconian lockdowns than we did. And the thought was they were going to lift that up and they were going to come roaring out of it. And then that just didn't happen. And what exactly has happened over the course of the last couple of years in where China finds itself facing so many difficulties, both in terms of the performance of domestic markets and their domestic markets. And you noted in particular, they really are in the midst of a property crisis. And maybe you could just talk through what exactly happened when we came out of COVID. Why haven't they bounced back?
It's two words: real estate. Because I think that the key characteristic of the Chinese economy for many, many years before 2020 was an over dependence on real estate investment, construction industries, land ownership in order to fuel the economy. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. I think that a big one that isn't always appreciated is that, so if you're an American middle-class household and you're thinking about your financial future, you have a lot of options. You're probably going to try to own your home so that you will have that asset, but you also have the opportunity to invest through your 401k or your IRA or just a regular brokerage account in some of the world's deepest, broadest, most liquid capital markets in the US. So you have opportunities to make investments in America's economic future that will also benefit you over time. And China never really developed those investment avenues, so everyone piled into real estate because it was the thing that they could buy. And they tended to borrow to do it in the same way that Americans will borrow over the course of our lifetime in order to buy property ourselves. But that was the only option they had. And so it fueled this incredible mania in property, and understand how many parts of the Chinese economy were dependent on this. So middle-class households were dependent on property ownership and revenue from rents because it was the only thing that they could invest in. So they were counting on this to safeguard their financial futures. Local governments are dependent on this for funding because oftentimes your city or municipal or provincial government would set up a sort of strange off-balance sheet investment vehicle that would use leveraged bets in property to basically filter money back into the local government. So, government finances are dependent on property. You had this enormous property development industry and all of their suppliers who are the ones who were creating jobs and investment growth. And so, come 2020, the government in Beijing decided that this was not sustainable, and they were right about that. So they started imposing a lot of restrictions in August of 2020 on mortgage lending, on ownership of multiple homes, that sort of thing. The goal deliberately was to try to prop this property bubble to put the Chinese economy on a more sustainable footing. And from that perspective, it is working. They have popped the bubble. Property prices are much lower than they were before. There doesn't seem to be a bottom in the market yet. You've had a bunch of developers who were, building their business models on all of this excessive leverage have gone under, which is something that probably needed to happen at some point or another. The problem is that whenever what you're ultimately talking about is having to unwind all of this credit-fueled excess, and as soon as you have a credit bubble, it is going to be a long and messy and painful process to try to work out from under that. And so that's what the Chinese economy is doing right now. And it is not helped by the fact that even at the same time that Beijing is trying to pop this property bubble, they are not creating new opportunities for entrepreneurs to create alternative pathways for capital or productive investment. So there's nothing for the economy to rotate into as it rotates out of this over-reliance on credit-fueled property manias.
So this, Joe, I mean, this seems like it's a really significant tension is at precisely the moment that China needs another source of growth, some kind of dynamism in the economy. President Xi has really consolidated control in Beijing. He's really wrapped the knuckles of private industry quite a bit. And I want to ask you about that, especially because you started in Hong Kong, which at the time in the mid-2000s was this vibrant world financial capital. And now you have a situation where the mainland has just cracked down there in such a significant fashion against dissent, against journalists. The Journal, your paper has written about this a lot. Hong Kong's biggest publisher, Jimmy Lai, is in prison just because he said things the government didn't like. What impact is that having on the economy and financial markets? Because, if I'm an investor, I need to be able to trust the transparency of the legal system and the data I'm getting. It isn't clear either of those things are true right now in Hong Kong and certainly in China.
Oh, it has a profound negative impact on the economy, which I think that some Westerners are only now starting to grapple with. So, I mean, Ryan, you are absolutely hitting the nail on the head there. What they need to do now, and what they seemed to be doing in the mid-2000s before Xi Jinping became the president in the early 2010s, they seemed to be on this continuous reform path that they had been on, where it was going to create more space in China for a private sector economy, more openness in the economy, more opportunities for entrepreneurship. And you could see the fruits of that reform process and how significant it was for economic development. You saw it in the development of all of these large tech companies, Alibaba being the perfect example, founded by Jack Ma. But all of this other entrepreneurship that was going on, taking advantage of the internet and greater openness to private entrepreneurship to create a more vibrant economy. And that has gone into reverse over the past 10 years. So you have this anxiety on the part of the Communist Party in Beijing that this might lead to challenges to their political authority. And so that has triggered an economic crackdown. I mean, at the same time that they were trying to pop the property bubble, you've seen regulatory investigations of everything from online tutoring to the Alibaba platform and online payment systems, to taxi services like the Chinese version of Uber or Lyft, came under investigation allocation at one time or another. And it's because Beijing is losing its tolerance for that private economy. And I think that, Hong Kong is the worst example of this because, when I lived in Hong Kong until 2014, when I left, it was still possible to think that this was going to be a model for mainland China of the prosperity that you could achieve if you opened up the economy to entrepreneurship and private enterprise. And not only are they not going in that direction on the mainland anymore, but they are not willing to tolerate that in Hong Kong either. And this is a big part of the picture here. And this is a globally relevant story because China is such a large economy. Back in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession would have been a lot worse in the US, except that at that time, the Chinese economy was actually growing at a reasonably healthy clip. So at least you had that billion plus consumers in the market who were sort of able to pick up some of the slack as the US went through a recession.
Yeah.
Looks like that's, we won't be able to count on that now if we don't achieve the soft landing that we've been hoping for.
Yeah. Joe, another thing you've written about quite a bit, and you wrote this in particular after the attempt on the life of former President Trump, just about the rise of political violence here in the US, here over in Europe. It is not just a figment of people's imaginations. In fact, the West Point, released data that the number of federal charges against people for making political threats or trying to carry out actual threats on politicians has almost doubled in the last 5 years. But of course, this is happening in Europe too. What is underpinning this, and how do we get out of this cycle? Because I think we all feel we pun fully intended. We dodged a bullet a month and a half ago here in America. We could have been in a very different and much darker place if that went a different way. How do you think we pull back from this cycle we're in?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist or a criminologist, so I'm stuck being just as confused as everyone else about why this seems to be happening. But I mean, you can make a couple observations in Europe in particular. I mean, first off, political violence, I think, has always been much more of a fact of life in Europe than it has been in the US. I think particularly if you look back at the 60s, 70s, 80s, we went through periods, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, where political violence was a terrible problem in the US, especially with the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations and RFK and other tragedies of that sort. In Europe, it was always going and it never quite let up. And now we seem to be coming into a new wave of it. And I think that there are a bunch of factors that appear to be coming together. One is just that normal politics is becoming much more contentious than it had been before. Voters in general, seem to be losing faith in a bunch of the parties of the old mainstream center and are drifting either more to the insurgent left or the insurgent right. We've seen that in a bunch of elections recently, whether it was here in the UK, in Germany, in France, in Italy. So I think that that's part of the backdrop, and then certainly part of the issue in Europe is Islamist violence, which is a form of political violence / terrorism, which I think has been an issue in some countries. But I think that it's I mean the best I can figure is that there is this tension right now where people feel that politics is much more a part of their lives than perhaps is healthy. I mean, this seems to be coming alongside the decline of a bunch of other social institutions and cultural institutions that used to give people a sense of meaning and belonging that cut across political divides. And Europe is having the same problem with atomization on that score that the US is having. And I think that it's also, resulting from that, you just have a lot of frustration and the sense that the political system is not responding to people's concerns. And in that environment, it becomes terrain where people who are violent or have evil intent, somehow might feel less constrained than they would otherwise.
Yeah. Speaking of the political system not responding to our concerns, you, of course, wrote a book a couple of years ago, title of which was The Theft of a Decade, how the baby boomers stole the millennials' economic future. And, in it, you wrote about how there have been these series of fiscal, monetary, regulatory policies that have just had the effect of shifting risk and frustration into the millennial generation, which I think I was born in 1980. I think you're about the same age.
82. So we're
82.
both older millennials.
Older millennials, yep. So it's kind of stuck it on our generation. And that's created a lot of resentment. Now, I don't know how much that feeds into what we were previously talking about, people getting so angry that they get violent. But talk about that a bit. You said this really accelerated after the financial crisis in 2008.
Yeah, I think that a big part of the story here is, over the past 15 years, somehow the political system has become less supple than it used to be in terms of its ability to manage a bunch of these intergenerational issues that you always have to balance, economic issues, between people who are doing well in the economy and people who are not doing well at a given moment. I mean, remember, we do politics in a democratic system so that we don't have to fight in the streets. I mean, politics is supposed to be our venue for mediating all of these disputes, balancing interests against each other, and coming up with some kind of compromise that we can live with. And I think that for various reasons, that process seems to really have been struggling over the past 15 years. I think it's partly because some of the responses to the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession scrambled the political system's ability to do that. I mean, I'm kind of a nerd for monetary issues and interest rates and quantitative easing and the like. And if you could have a very long, dry, but I think ultimately significant discussion about how some of the political trade-offs that were embedded in some of these policies that were never really explained to the public, and that are kind of abstruse, ended up having some of these big implications. I mean, that explains why you could have the situation where asset prices soared. So, I mean, you were in a great position if you happened to own your home in 2008, or if you were already invested in the stock market, because those assets would go up, but you were in a real bind if you had not had an opportunity to start acquiring that kind of wealth yet, because you were going to lose out.
Yeah.
And I think part of the issue here is that some of these policy issues are complicated and they're abstruse, and the public often rightly thinks that ordinary voters think they have better things to do with their time than sort out the details of a quantitative easing or tightening policy, and they're right about that. The real point is that I think that policymakers have to understand that they have a responsibility to the public to make these trade-offs, keeping in mind sort of where the political balance is likely to be, and trying to reach an appropriate balancing of interests there, and perhaps being a bit more responsive to signals from the political system that people are not happy with these trade-offs. And I think that was the big failure in a lot of these policies.
It's interesting. I don't know if you saw the interview George W. Bush gave the other day, and he got asked about the roots of why is everybody so angry. And he just went back to 2008. He said, Hank Paulson came to me and said, we have to bail out the banks. And, you can argue for all kinds of reasons we did, but that really pissed people off, and they still have not gotten over it.
I think that there's a lot to that, because again, I think that people, were unhappy about the fact that there didn't seem to be any justice, in the crisis. And I'm not talking justice in sort of a Jacobin off with their heads sense. It's sort of like there was a resistance to allowing the market to mete out the justice that a market economy usually should, where you reward success and then you punish failure. And so that market punishment for failure seemed to be thwarted by so much of what the government did after 2008. And you could kind of see that continuing with, again, some of these policies that people would read about in the newspaper and have a vague idea of what the Federal Reserve or the Treasury or some of these other agencies were doing, wouldn't necessarily understand, what those were. And I have a lot of sympathy for that because, why would you?
Yeah.
But again, if you are the person who is making that kind of policy, all the more responsibility that you have then to be alert to the fact that, if the political mood is deteriorating in the country, that might be a sign that what you're doing is not actually working in the way that it should. And there is a tendency to forget that what a lot of politicians and policymakers were doing then was balancing interests. And so you could have large banks that are teetering on the precipice, and that's going to be a very noisy constituency for one course of action. There is a tendency to forget, other people who might have different views about what should happen, or who might be negatively affected by, decisions that you were making that would benefit one set of people.
It's interesting and dispiriting. We just had this debate. It may well be our only debate. And everything you just talked about was not talked about at all. An issue that is very closely connected to this issue of trade-offs. The Congressional Budget Office reported this week we're going to have $2 trillion deficit this year, which is unprecedented historically, to have a deficit that big at a moment when the economy's hanging in there, stock market's doing okay, job market's doing, and yet we still have a $2 trillion deficit, which means if we tip into a recession, it's not hard to see how that becomes a $3 or $4 trillion deficit, driven in large part by a lot of these intergenerational transfer programs. And none of that got discussed on Tuesday night.
Well, Ryan, actually, I think you're being a little too generous there, because it's not that they haven't discussed these issues. They have, and they are actively promising to do the wrong thing about them.
That's true. That is their policy. Yeah.
I mean, the key pledge from both sides is that they are absolutely not going to touch any form of entitlement reform, which absolutely implicates all of these generational fairness issues. It implicates a bunch of economic policy issues. What is going to be the size of the government, and what kind of demands is it going to have to make on the economy, and what will be the implications of that for economic growth. I mean, it's been a very dispiriting, not just this campaign, the past few election cycles have been very dispiriting in this way, that there's just a resolute resistance to engaging with any of these issues. And I think that there are several reasons for that. First off, I think that politicians are aware that you have a large cohort of somewhat older voters who might be resistant to some of these reforms, and you can't gainsay that. I think that is a political persuasion task, to reassure baby boomers that their benefits are going to be safe, but that we need to reform these programs for the sake of younger people. And that is the kind of political leadership that no one wants to show. And frankly, speaking as a member of the press here, I usually try to stay out of media criticism, but on this one point, I will say that I think that there has been a resistance or a reluctance on the part of a lot of the media to ask candidates about this when we do get the chance. And I think it's because something that's going wrong with the media is that there's a tendency to focus on the horse race aspect of campaigns: who's up in the polls, who's down, who's winning in this state, who's winning and who's losing in that state. There is not enough willingness on the part of the press to engage with issues in a way that can, better inform voters about what's going on so that voters are able to make informed decisions when they go to vote.
Well, the shame of it is, and you've looked at these issues really closely, we have to it no labels for a lot of the policy work we've done, is however you talk about, fixing Medicare and Social Security, both of which are, according to the trustees who run the program, scheduled to not be able to pull up, pay out full benefits within a decade, is the sooner you deal with it and you can phase in whatever changes you make over the course of decades, where most people probably won't even notice. You can do it in a really gradual fashion, or you can just wait until a crisis hit 10 years from now, and we'll find ourselves in a situation where we get an announcement from the actuaries, hey, Congress, you either fix this or in a month, people's Social Security checks will be 20% less than they were the month before.
Yeah, so Ryan, you and I started this chat talking about some potential economic October surprises. An entitlement collapse is not going to be one in this election cycle, but it's an interesting contrast because the three things that we were talking about, whether it's some kind of financial event in the U.S., problems in the Chinese economy creating a contagion to America, or European contagion to America. Those are you can kind of see that there might be a problem there, but you're not able to predict with precision that there will be a crisis. I mean, this is all sort of more in the spirit of a general warning, or guys, we need to be aware that these are dangers that are lurking out there in a dangerous world. But with the entitlement stuff, it is an entirely foreseeable crisis.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a resistance on the part of too many politicians and perhaps even some voters to grapple with the fact that we either do reform the government programs now at a time when we have some latitude to decide how we want to do it and some wiggle room to work with, or we wait until we create a crisis for ourselves that we then need to dig out of. That's kind of the choice. There is no choice where you just don't reform them and then they go on without creating problems forever.
Yeah, no, we got a chance to talk to George Will at the Washington Post. He calls this the most predictable crisis in American history, and he's right. Why don't we get to some questions? Looks like we got a lot of people teed up. You spurred plenty of thinking here, and if you can just say your name and where you're from. Let's start with Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. Cheryl, I think you are on mute.
There we go. Now, am I okay?
You're all set.
Okay. From St. Louis area. I get really confused trying to understand when the former president talks about tariffs, because the way I understand him, we force somebody else to pay higher. They're going to force it down the line or up the line or whatever. Can you explain it in more easy terms for a layman?
There you go, Joe. Talk about the tariffs.
Okay, well, so since I'm an opinion journalist, I have the luxury of giving you an opinion. And Cheryl, I would say that the reason that you're kind of confused about some of the rhetoric on that is that it doesn't make any sense. So it's not just you. I mean, look, this is an age-old discussion going back centuries about tariffs, and the idea is that you protect your domestic industries by shutting out cheap imports, and that creates room for your domestic producers to charge somewhat higher prices. But you're absolutely right. Former President Trump is wrong if the suggestion is that China is going to pay the tariffs, because the end consumer, which in this case is the American household, always ends up paying the higher prices. The whole point of this exercise is to make American consumers pay higher prices, to force them to do that, to pay higher prices that are arguably more competitive for domestic producers, because those domestic producers would struggle to cut their prices to match the foreign product. Now, one thing I want to point out in all of this is that what's so pernicious about some of this rhetoric is that at the same time that you're having that very distorted argument about tariffs, we're resisting so many opportunities to make American industries and service companies more competitive without, that would allow them to actually charge lower prices to Americans instead of making the American industry more competitive by forcing ourselves to pay higher prices. So, I mean, one issue that my colleagues and I have been following is this, controversy over the Japanese company Nippon Steel that wants to buy U.S. steel. And I mean, the key point there is that they are committed to continuing to manufacture in the U.S., to employ Americans, and in fact, to invest in American steel manufacturing factories, so that those facilities can be more productive and hire Americans to produce those products at home instead of having to import them. And yet a bipartisan determination has sprung up in Washington to block that kind of investment. I mean, this actually is an instance where you have a Japanese company that wants to pay money to make an American company more competitive and create better jobs for Americans. And Washington is resisting that. Both parties are. And so I think that, this is an example of how there's this tendency to reach for something like tariffs, which seems like a very easy issue. At first, it might make intuitive sense to voters, and you can kind of understand why. But as you look closer at it, you realize that it is just an enormous missed opportunity. And it's something that I think both parties have ended up falling into.
So this is Bob from Boulder, Colorado. Sorry, I'm walking to an airport. I'm going to read your book. I love the title, and I want to comment on that. I'm a baby boomer with a decent amount of wealth. My kids did not get to pick their parents. And do they really deserve all that wealth? We have a tremendous amount of wealth held by a small sliver of the population. We know that wealth taxes are problematic. We know that income taxes dampen economic dynamism. So to me, the least bad option is to tax dead people with a much bigger state tax, but also taxing more modest estates to pay back what they earned in Social Security and Medicare. I know it sounds draconian, but we have a huge debt. And if we take the estate tax and earmark it for debt reduction, maybe that would sell. Your opinion?
What do you think, Joe?
So I am generally not a big fan of inheritance or estate taxes in the US. And I'll tell you why, actually with reference to the UK where I live, because I think that actually the situation is very different. And this also gives us an idea of something that we need to be wary of developing in the US. So historically in the US, a lot of the intergenerational wealth ended, was tied to productive investment. So, you have someone who starts a company or invests in the farm and then passes the wealth from that on to the next generation. And then it perhaps goes down another few generations, but ultimately it ends up dissipating. And so, I mean, it's been a while since I looked at the numbers. I think in the US, historically, we didn't have a situation where wealth was passing more than a few generations. And meanwhile, you had ample opportunities for other people to create new wealth that they could pass on. So I think the key thing that makes you not need to worry about an inheritance tax is if you're in a situation where actually the inheritances that you're talking about are arising from entrepreneurship, or business activities that create new economic opportunities for a bunch of people in that orbit. And also it ends up not being heritable over a large number of generations. Now, the contrast to that is property, which is a big issue in the UK and also in Europe, where so much of the intergenerational wealth transfer is actually real estate, rather than small business wealth or even financial assets or investments. And I think there it does become much more of an issue because you have this fairness problem where you basically have no mechanism that will kind of create new opportunities to own property, and you also don't have a lot of other opportunities in the economy for people to accumulate wealth in other ways. Britain also has a real entrepreneurship problem right now. So it's very difficult if you are a small innovator or an entrepreneurship here to develop your wealth in that way. So I think, if that maybe starts some thinking in the US context, where I am still not bothered by people wanting to pass on to their heirs the wealth that they built up over their lifetime from entrepreneurial activity, from investment, from activities that create jobs and provide value for other Americans, consumers. But I do think that we need to avoid creating a situation where high valued real estate is the thing that you're passing on. And the way that you do that is by making sure that you have an economy that will keep open this entrepreneurship pathway. I think that's always been a great strength in the US, and we need to make sure that it stays that way.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed this, and I really enjoyed the Q&A too.
Joe, if people want to read your column in the Journal, Wall Street Journal, does it run on the same day?
Yes, it's the political economics column in the opinion section of the Journal. It's in print every Friday, and it goes online usually Thursday afternoons.
There you go. Okay, Joe, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on No Labels Talks.